Good morning. It sure is wonderful to be back in Sangat or community. Oh, thank you, Jackie and Mark, for your beautiful words leading into what I'd like to share this morning. To participate willingly in the process of change is my reason for being on the spiritual path. And so I'm a student of life, being willing to participate in the process of change. And in the song that Jackie sang for us, to be of the Christ, a living expression, leads me into what inspired me this week for this message. And that is the idea that in Genesis, we know that when God first moved, the words were, let there be light, let there be light. And so I hear in that an allowing, a willingness. And during the month of August, in unity centers across the world, the spiritual faculty of will and how the will that is spiritualized is different from the human will, from what we call will power. And so I'm just so excited this morning to be back with all of you. The only thing that's going to be better is when I can hug you in person. And so in terms of let there be light, I took in these words throughout this message, and I hope they are a blessing. And the words are to activate the spiritual faculty of will by deciding, I will there be light. I will there be light. I will there be light in the screen of my consciousness. I will that my awareness be connected to the light, to that Christ presence, which lives at the core of me, unchanged, constant, and always beckoning. I'd like to read one of the most powerful manifestations in the New Testament of the fact that the spiritual faculty of will is actually, according to Charles Fillmore anyway, it is the spiritual faculty that activates the other 11. But in scripture from the Master, we have a very clear expression of the challenge that I know still exists for me. So I can be gentler with myself when I read these words from the book of Luke, chapter 24, starting at verse 41. When Jesus himself is tempted, is struggling, is aware that the use of his personal will got in there. It was getting in there. And so is it any surprise that for me, it's often a moment by moment conscious decision to get my willfulness out of the way. And so here we have the Master going to a quiet place to pray. So again, this is the book of Luke, chapter 22, verse 41. And he withdrew from them about the distance of a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, saying, O Father, if thou will, let this cup pass from me. Don't we do that? We ask that our opportunities to rise, because we're seduced and tempted by how they look in the outer, our first thing, according to the ego and the will, is to ask to have it removed somehow, as if there wasn't good in it. So that's how Jesus starts. In his humanity, he says, if thou wilt, let this cup pass from me. And almost in the next breath, or even the same breath, he returns to, but not as I will, but thy will be done. What happened next for Jesus happens for me too, when I remember that my willfulness is not my faculty, my spiritual faculty of will. And so as soon as I remember, oh no, I'm wanting this to pass from me. And as soon as I say, not as I will, but my will is thy will, what happens for me is exactly what happened next for Jesus. And that is that there appeared to him an angel from heaven to strengthen him. So there we have the angel, of course, in scripture, always metaphysically representing a direct message from God, showing up with the strength. Maybe you too require the strength this morning to identify and to isolate those moments when, like me, you might be tempted by your personal willfulness as opposed to aligning with my spiritual faculty of will, located interestingly right at the base of the hairline and the forehead in terms of Fillmore's physical assigning the power of will. And so when I remember that in my willfulness, I'm going to cause destruction, when I realize that I need strength, the first thing I want to do is to remember, I will there be light. I will there be light. This morning, I have three primary images or symbols that I hope you will find helpful. They've been a wonderful help to me this week and even before. And at first glance, they sound a little bit incongruent. And yet for me, they allowed me to affirm more consistently, I will there be light. And here they are. The first symbol is a rope. The second one is a door. And the last one is a little harder because it's not quite as concrete as the rope and the door. But it has been my clearest path to aligning with God's will, with my spiritual faculty of will. And that is something that I see as a square, as a compartment in my consciousness. And it's something I learned through a lot of pain in my very first ministry. It's what I call, and some of you who are in more regular contact with me have probably heard me say it, I call it my I don't know mind. My I don't know mind. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the rope. I'll talk about how the door has become helpful for me. And finally, I will share with you how ultimately for me to raise my awareness that I might be in my willful human will instead of in the divine partnership with the will that is the same as mine, which is always good, the will of the divine. So there you have the title for this morning's message that came through me, in partnership with the divine. So this rope, for me, is attached to the boat that is my consciousness. And so we know that whenever you have a boat and a rope, then you probably have an anchor. And so I ask myself in a visual way, how far do I let my mind wander from the light in me? So if I picture the anchor that is holding the boat, which is my awareness being anchored to my Christ consciousness or to the light in me, if I ask myself, how far do I let my mind wander? I realize that the shorter the rope that the anchor is on, it lets the boat drift only slightly before the taut, tight line of the rope tugs the boat back to center. And so I use that image as a way to remember, I suppose, that I am in divine partnership with divine will. And will I at times fall prey to my willfulness and wander from my Christ center, from the light, even after perhaps I have started my day by saying, I will, there be light. And by the way, those of you who are course students, you will find that is lesson 73. I will, there be light. And so oftentimes that rope will come to mind as a symbol of, oh, I think the rope is kind of loose and I've really wandered far, and I let and I will light to be where I am anchored. So that's the first one. The second one is one that actually I got from the Practicing the Presence. Some of you know that I have been immersed in Practicing the Presence by Joel Goldsmith. And you'll find this image on page 106 in Practicing the Presence. And it's really helped me. It helped me this week launch the spiritual faculty of will for August, as we were approaching August 1st today. And it's the image of the door. So we have the rope, which signals how far I wander. Then once we've made sure that that rope is shorter and shorter, that we don't get so far away from the light, then the second image comes up for me of this door. And the teacher that he is, Joel simply asks, how hard would it be? I love these kind of questions. How hard would it be to develop the habit of waiting 1 second every time that I'm about to go through an open door or close a door or walk back through a door? How hard would it be to realize in that moment that I am the light, that I will, there be light? So I, just for fun, earlier this week, I counted the number of doors in this old house, and I can just tell you that I am going to have plenty of opportunities to develop the habit of stopping for 1 second and taking inner inventory to say, am I willing there be light in this moment, or did my rope just get kind of loose and take me far away from the light, which is the truth about me, and that's always changelessly shining, waiting for me to remember it. So there you have the rope, the door, as an introduction into what I'd really like to share with you today. But finally, let me just circle back to the I don't know mind, which I mentioned in my introduction. I learned at with a great amount of surrendering, yielding. You know, I never thought that I was going to know everything when I was 21 and first started teaching. So in my teaching career that spanned half a lifetime, I would often say to myself, just remember what Socrates said, all I know is that I know nothing. But I'll tell you something. In my first ministry, it didn't take very long, in the midst of a very, very, I guess just for me, exceptional situation, for me to realize, oh my God, I really do know nothing. How did I get into this situation where I thought I was going to be just teaching principles? I thought I was going to be in the midst of like-minded people, and instead there was, as you know, fraud that had been going on for 7 years, and I showed up in the 7th year at its completion. And whether it was with the bank manager or the insurance people, and above all, with the private detective assigned to it, I literally felt like I was in quicksand. What am I doing here? So they would ask me a question about QuickBooks, or they would ask me a question about controls in the office. And I just very quickly realized the best thing I could do was to tell the truth and say, I don't know. Eventually, in those almost 5 years, my prayer as I left home, I had a 1-hour commute to the church. When I'd leave in the morning, I would just say, I don't know, but Spirit knows. I don't know, but Spirit knows. I have found that a very direct way to humble myself when my personal will wants to drive the bus. Where does the temptation that Jesus talked about in Gethsemane come up most often for us to engage our personal will and to become willful? Well, I don't know about you, but I have spent decades just trying my best in a second, as quickly as I can go through that door, to suspend judgment. And so judgment is the biggest temptation for me. Perhaps that's not yours, but it is a question worth asking. When does my human will, my willfulness, my small will, when is it most tempted to go into action? Oh, and all those wonderful, wonderful teachers who show up and trigger us with tempting us to think that we know when we don't. Because the minute we're in thinking, we're in our small self, and knowledge is of spirit, but perception is always of my humanness, of my human will. And so in terms of I will there be light, it's the same as what we heard in our opening hymn. I will to be of the Christ, a living expression. And you know what? We don't have to will very hard, because as the poet Alfred Tennyson reminds us, and his words for me echo down through the centuries, God is closer than breathing to me, closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. And so how hard my human will must work to allow me to forget that omnipresence that is in my breath, that lives in me and as me. And so in the last few minutes, which, believe it or not, is actually the core of the message that I'm receiving for this first week in August, I'd like to share with you something that I have probably read. I don't know. It's from a daily inspiration book that's called Living in God, and it's written by spiritual teacher Roy Eugene Davis, who, among other things, brought the teacher Yogananda to the West. And I still can't get over it myself, but I've had this book since 1994, and pretty much on a regular basis, it is one of the books that I start my day with. But somehow, and I know many of you had this experience before me, that you go back to a book and you think, this was not here for whatever that is since 1994, 27 years. It couldn't have been here, because surely, even if my understanding was not exactly what it is now, but surely to God I would have seen it, wouldn't I? Well, no. That's where the willingness, the yielding, the willing to be led becomes more dominant the more time that we spend practicing the presence. And believe it or not, in the last week of July, I found in this book what are outlined as the seven steps to spiritual illumination. And so all of this last week, I thought, wow, look at that. I will there be light. I will there be light. And here are 7 steps for willing that light to be more consistent, more constant, more changeless in my awareness, because it hasn't gone anywhere, right? So here's the thing. I'm also growing as a teacher, and I appreciate you guys helping me do that, because I can't do all 7 of them today. And it just so happens that that's a good thing, because I'm not sure I've even entered the last 3 stages of spiritual illumination. So I will be sharing with you 4 of them from Roy Eugene Davis's work, again, titled Living in God. So his book is called Living in God. Roy Eugene Davis gives us 7 steps to spiritual illumination. And I guess in terms of the inspirational words from today, participating willingly in the process of change, or even calling up the words again of the hymn, I will to be an expression of the Christ, a living expression of the Christ. Well, if I'm serious about that, if I will there be light, then certainly I avail myself of these 3 steps. So next Sunday, we will look at the last 3. And at the end of today's message, in case some of you, don't listen to the recording or won't be here next Sunday, I will mention the last 3, but I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes or so immersing ourselves in the first 3 steps. I guess the one other thing that I am gentle with myself about is that when I look at these first 3 steps, I notice that I have been back and forth among them. And maybe that's why I haven't fully entered 5, 6, or 7. And so perhaps you will hold me in the light of your prayers as I continue to say, I will there be light. I will there be light. So the first step is something that he calls unconsciousness. So I guess another way I hear that is that these are the symptoms of being asleep, and these are the habits of knowing that our soul's life forces are still mostly dormant. And I can certainly remember living in stage 1 most of the time and try not to go there as I say, I will there be light. So in this unconsciousness stage 1, we are completely identified when we're there with the mind and the body, and the mind perceives itself to just be that, a mind and a body. It is characterized by, are you ready? Maybe you won't recognize any of these, but boy, I lived there. This first stage of unconsciousness is characterized by rigid beliefs, unreasoned opinions, which is an interesting word, unreasoned, not unreasonable, but unreasoned, which means that we haven't thought them through, right? So it's characterized by rigid beliefs, unreasoned opinions, dullness, apathy, boredom. There are memories and habits and learned behavior that drive our bus. And in this first stage, the soul's life forces are mostly dormant. They are mostly dormant. Just want to see if there's anything else that my notes didn't have. He says in the first stage, which he calls unconsciousness, he says, belief in God and ways to salvation are more important than knowledge. He says, spiritual fulfillment, if it is even envisioned as a possibility, is thought of as, a future accomplishment. And so it's interesting that in this first stage, our activities internally and how we show up in the world, in that first stage, we are survival oriented. We are impelled, and let's put it in the past tense, okay? When we were in the first stage, we were impelled by desires, whims, by the influences of others, and social and cultural traditions tended to determine our lifestyle, right? And then we woke up. We suffered enough. Something wonderfully huge that rocked our world happened, and we entered phase 2. He calls phase 2 dysfunctional self-consciousness. So that's interesting to me because the first one is unconsciousness. So you might remember, as I do, living there. So the first stage is unconsciousness. The next stage towards spiritual illumination is dysfunctional self-consciousness. So that was interesting to me because how I translate dysfunctional self-consciousness is that I'm awake, but not for good necessarily use of that wakefulness. So I'm awake, I'm aware, but Davis suggests in this second stage, it's still dysfunctional self-consciousness. He says this is the second stage of soul awakening or of our divine journey toward willing there be light. So see if you recognize any of these characteristics of the second phase of awakening. Mental confusion, conflicted emotional states, egocentric preoccupation with the illusion of my personality or others is prevalent. Then he goes into, we've seen some people go off in this direction, fascinated with mediumship or supernatural powers or any kind of misguided endeavors, he calls them anyway, in connecting with other spheres. And here are the behaviors. So now you have the characteristics of stage 2, which is irrational thinking, conflicted emotional, obsession with personality and self, small self. He says the symptoms are in this second stage that we were at the mercy of our intellectual discrimination being weak. It was weak. So there were perhaps addictions, compulsions, obsessions. This is where dependent emotional relationships prevail in the second stage. We know that we have self-defeating behaviors, hence the dysfunctional self-consciousness. We know those behaviors are self-defeating, and yet we're not quite in our awareness or in our willing to do God's will or to allow light to be our will. And so we continue to complain or find fault or even to fantasize. And so what determines our thinking and behavior most often, not surprising, is the subconscious, which drives the bus without our awareness, and our emotions. Meditation during this phase, and at least it's here, right? In the asleep first stage, meditation didn't even figure. But by the time that we're in the second phase and we are consciously practicing the presence, spending time in the silence, he says the thing is, our focus in that stage of our moving toward spiritual illumination might be more on having a religious experience than knowing we are growing spiritually and that we are progressing spiritually. So he says in conclusion about phase 2 that during the dysfunctional self-conscious stage, the soul's life forces are only partially aroused. So ask yourself, do I ever go back into being completely asleep? Am I sometimes still in the dysfunctional self-consciousness? Or we're going to look at the third and final stage for today and notice where we can give ourselves brownie points or move to boardwalk because we are willing that there be light more often than not. So here's the third stage. He calls it functional self-consciousness. So we have unconsciousness followed by dysfunctional self-consciousness. And next we will arrive in what he calls functional self-consciousness. Do you know what, folks? These are really long entries for like a daily inspiration. And what really amazes me, and it just tells us how asleep we can be without even knowing it. How could I have read, the week of July for how many years, every year, and usually, the daily inspiration is a sentence or two. I would have thought I would have stopped on these 7 stages if for no other reason, because they're not 2 or 3 sentences. They're a full page, and I still must have been asleep. And I'm gentle with myself and recognize that we all are ever unfolding, ever expressing the divine to the best of our consciousness. And to take away from today the affirmation, I will there be light, is a decision to go to I don't know mind whenever I'm tempted to judge, and to remember, I don't know. I can't possibly know what I'm thinking that I know about this situation or this person. So obviously in stage 3, the soul's life forces are more awake. Well, thank you, God, for that, for stage 3. And in stage 3, soul illumination is gradually emerging. Okay, so you hear the light in that starting to be more and more prevalent in our awareness. The soul's life forces in stage 3 are more awake, and consciousness of the light in us is gradually emerging. And I like to say for myself, yes, it's emerging in my awareness, and I'm more consistently willing to stay in that consciousness. So this is what he says about stage 3, functional self-consciousness. He says, even though this stage is more healthy-minded, and even though it is progressive from stage 1 and 2, he said this stage 3 is still mostly an egocentric phase, because there are rational and nurturing choices that are determining our behaviors, and our goal-oriented actions are usually skill-based, but there's still only partial intellectual comprehension of the reality of God. But guess what gets in there? Some of our traditional beliefs, oh my, and who hasn't had a ton of those to clean up? I know I have. Still intermingled with some of those old traditional beliefs, and of course, illusions, like believing that there's 2 powers, or believing that there is any power in evil, which is a nothing. And so he says in this third stage, you might find that you're more interested in accessing the divine as a way to acquire power. And we know that power that is divine power cannot be acquired. It can only be allowed to come through us. He says that in this phase, meditation and prayer time might be directed to improving physically, or psychologically. Like this is where Goldsmith, for one, says, don't pray for health. If you had perfect health and you didn't have God, what good is that? Don't pray for supply. Don't pray for companionship or a home, he says. And so it's interesting to note that in this final stage that is called functional self-consciousness, that we are meditating and praying when we're in that stage, trying to improve physically, psychologically, or we're praying and meditating as a way to enhance the accomplishment of our personal goals. So I don't know about you, but I'm learning a lot about even my prayer life and my activity of meditating from what he's assigning to spiritual illumination growth. Finally, in this third stage, while we might be curious, we remember when it first started to seep in that you were curious about the metaphysical cause of an otherwise seemingly mundane event. Remember that when you were first in stage 3 and you'd have a glimmer and you'd think, wow, I wonder if this means something more than it appears to mean. So he said, you might be curious that way in stage 3 of your illumination. And you may even have landed on the desire for spiritual growth. But the thing is, interest in the world and in projects and in using the human will to accomplish is still more compelling. So these are all ways that I can assess my own progress towards living from I will there be light. He says not to be surprised in stage 3 that there are some of the characteristics common in 1 and 2 that are still trying to have an influence. And isn't that wonderful? Like what an invitation for us to be gentle with ourselves, to just say, wow, look at that. That's coming up from stage 1 or stage 2. And so to close the 7 steps, having really only shared with you the first 3, I will say that stage 3 is characterized by the fact that the soul's life forces are definitely awakening and soul consciousness is definitely starting to happen. And what a way for me to just continue to use my will and be in divine partnership with divine will and say, I will there be light. So I will come back next Sunday to the last 3, but I will tell you how they are headed just for fun, because I wouldn't be surprised if some of you are already there. It's very difficult for me to assess exactly where I am, but I'm willing through divine will to take an honest look. So stage 4 is super consciousness. Stage 5 is cosmic consciousness. Can you hear the expansion of awareness? So stage 5 is cosmic. Stage 6 is what he calls God is realized, God realization. And of course, the final stage is illumination. And so if you are joining me this week in working towards willing there to be light, if you are interested in spiritual illumination, then I leave you with the gifts of noticing how long the rope is from the anchor of the Christ consciousness. Perhaps you'll never be the same about the doors in your house or elsewhere. I know I won't. I'm always going to follow the admonition to stop for a second and say, I will there be light. God is here. And finally, the opposite for me of the human will is not only surrender and willingness to yield, it's also humility. It's also the ability to say over and over, no matter how often we're tempted, I don't know. I'm in my I don't know mind. Well, don't you think this or that's terrible? And what about this? I don't know. I don't know. And people will invite us, won't they, into that temptation. And for me, my I don't know mind is a really favorite place to go. I'd like to share with you in closing the greatest gift. Deep breath in with me. This is the truth, and I name and claim it for myself, and I invite you to name and claim it for yourself as the truth. There is no greater gift that can come to any person than the unswerving conviction that God cares for me, that God cares for you. I'll say it again. The greatest gift that can come to any person is the unswerving conviction. Do you hear having faith that God loves me? Having faith that God loves you. The unswerving conviction that God cares for me. God cares for you. Goldsmith warns us, though, that no one can have that gift. No one can have the unswerving conviction that God is loving me without continuous, consciously living in the presence through stillness and practicing the presence. I love you. I bless you. Let us prepare for a time of practicing the presence together in this beloved community of spiritual seekers, willing there be light. I will there be light.